think it is. Yeah, it's on. Awesome.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session on protecting California water quality for tribal culture, tradition, and subsistence. My name is Adriana Renteria. I'm with the California State Water Resources Control Board, where I serve as the director for the Office of Public Participation and the tribal liaison for the water boards.
Good afternoon. Is everybody awake after lunch? Okay, thanks. My name is Elizabeth Herrera. I work with Adriana in the Office of Public Participation. I focus on tribal affairs and the SAFER program.
Elizabeth and I are really excited to welcome you and to have this session together with you. So to begin framing for our conversation today, you can stay on this one. Thank you. To begin framing for our conversation today, California Native American tribes have been using water for traditional, cultural, ceremonial, and subsistence purposes since time immemorial. And for many, many years now, California tribal leaders and tribal advocates had been telling the water boards that the way that the water boards was quantifying uses of water and establishing water quality measures were not protective of the specific and unique uses of water of tribal communities. So after many, many years of tribal-led advocacy with the water boards adopted and defined two definitions for tribal beneficial uses. And this was really a big win. That happened in 2017. 5 years later, we are now at a point where we are taking those definitions and thinking about how they apply to local water bodies at the regional level. And the same way that the process of defining tribal beneficial uses was led by tribal leaders and tribal advocates, this process of designating water bodies with tribal beneficial uses also needs to be led by tribal leaders and tribal advocates. So really the purpose of today's session is to talk about the regulatory process of designating those water bodies so that you all can continue to lead and engage in this process. And then before we go over today's agenda, we're going to be passing in, if you'd like to be added to our Tribal Affairs email list to find out updates on the tribal beneficial use process, we encourage you to sign up. We also have a draft educational guidance document on the tribal beneficial uses process in the back, as well as one of the handouts that we're going to be using today. So a brief overview of today's agenda. We're going to be providing an overview of what are the water boards and what is the basin plan regulatory process. We'll pause and have a couple of question and answers after that session. And then we're going to talk about the specific efforts that are taking place at the regional water board level. And then after we wrap up the updates at the regional water board level, we have a tool that we want to walk through with you to talk about the process of submitting designation letters. So who are the California water boards? So the image on the screen shows the California Environmental Protection Agency, and this is an agency that's dedicated to protecting the environment and public health. The water boards are one of the boards that are part of this Cali-PA umbrella. The water boards are made up of 10 independent boards, well, semi-independent boards. We have one state water board and we have 9 semi-autonomous regional water boards. And the mission of the water boards collectively is to preserve, enhance, and restore California water resources and drinking water for the protection of the environment, public health, and all beneficial uses. So today's session is really going to be focusing on that section on beneficial uses. So here's an overview of the state water board and then the 9 regional water boards. So the state water board is responsible for establishing statewide water quality standards. It's responsible for ensuring that public water systems are serving and providing safe and affordable drinking water. It's responsible for allocating surface water rights. And the state water board is also responsible for coordinating the statewide tribal affairs program. The 9 regional water boards are located across the state and they're semi-autonomous. And I mentioned that semi-autonomous piece because there's a balance that takes place with the regional water boards and the state water board. So whereas the State Water Board establishes those statewide water quality standards, the regional water boards then have to say, okay, how do these standards apply to the waters within our region? And they make that determination within their basin plans. So these basin plans are what we're going to be talking about today. And they are essentially guiding documents for the regions on what are the waters within the region, so the lakes, rivers, and streams, what are the ways that people use those waters, and then what are the water quality standards that need to be met in order to have people continue to use those waters. Anytime a regional water board wants to make a change to a basin plan, that's called a basin plan amendment. And anytime they want to make an amendment, they have to then bring it back to the state water board. The state water board then approves or denies that amendment. So I mention this because yes, the regional water boards are semi-autonomous, and there's still this balance with the state water board too. As part of the basin plan amendments, or as part of the basin plans, regional water boards also have monitoring networks for water quality, and they also issue water quality permits, as well as issue enforcement actions when water quality objectives are violated. All right. Here's a quick overview of our statewide tribal affairs program. The State Water Board conducts government-to-government consultations, both when it comes to consultations under AB 52 that are triggered by the California Environmental Equality Act, or CEQA, as well as other consultations that are not required under AB 52, but are in alignment with our tribal consultation policy. We provide and work with tribal water systems who are in need of assistance when it comes to safe and affordable drinking water, and we partner with Cali, PA, US EPA Region 9 and Indian Health Service to identify if there's any gaps for drinking water. We'll talk about tribal beneficial uses today. And then part of our work is also making sure that our surface water ambient monitoring programs are addressing tribal needs when it comes to bioaccumulation and impacts to our surface waters. And if you have any questions about that, Anna here in the front is available to talk more about that. So just for some awareness, in 2019, the water boards adopted our tribal consultation policy, where we reaffirm and recommit ourselves to meaningful engagement with California Native American tribes. As part of our consultation policy, we established one statewide tribal liaison, which I'm serving as the statewide liaison. And we also established tribal coordinators in all of the regions and in the major divisions. The consultation policy also provides guidance for staff for how to conduct consultations. In 2020, the California Environmental Protection Agency adopted their tribal consultation protocol, which has even more guidance for staff for how to conduct meaningful, respectful tribal consultations. So this is just a slide that has information about who your points of contacts are. I'm a resource to all of you. Besides tribal beneficial uses, I can help connect you with other, help you navigate the water board system and help get you connected to the right person or to the right program. That bit.ly at the bottom, it has information for the 9 regional tribal coordinators, and they're gonna be your points of contact when it comes to tribal beneficial uses locally. All right, so now we're getting into the basin planning process. So how do the water boards protect water quality? So like we mentioned, first, the State Water Board establishes statewide water quality standards. The other thing that the State Water Board does, it establishes definitions for beneficial uses. So beneficial uses are a category of ways that we use water. So recreation is a way that people use water. Boating, navigation, fishing, agriculture, drinking water, those are all examples of beneficial uses. Today, we're talking about the tribal beneficial uses, and those were adopted in 2017. So after the State Water Board establishes those water quality standards and those definitions, Then it's up to the regional water boards to determine what is that going to mean at the local level. And they do that through basin plans. The basin plans look at all of the water within their region. They identify all of the lakes, rivers, and streams. And then once they have an identification of those water bodies, they then establish beneficial uses. So what are people using this lake for? And they list out all of the possible ways that this lake is used. Once they establish those beneficial uses, they then have to determine water quality objectives. So if we know that people use this lake for recreation and swimming, what would be the acceptable water quality levels to allow the public to continue to use that lake for swimming and to maintain public health? So they establish those water quality objectives based on the way that people are using that water. So in the example of swimming, we want to have a better water quality when it comes to waters that are used for swimming, as opposed to maybe waters that are used for navigation and that are used by transporting goods, right? Because that's going to have more of an impact. Swimming is going to have more of an impact to public health. So we want to have more protective water quality objectives. After they establish what would be the water quality objectives, then they have to develop implementation plans. And this is essentially how they're going to meet those water quality objectives. So this is where they can develop monitoring programs to establish a baseline understanding of what the water quality is. And they could also think about remediation projects to improve water quality if they're not able to meet water quality objectives. So all of that is part of what is the Regional Water Board basin plans. And the basin plans are really important because anytime that somebody wants to use water that may impact water quality, they have to apply for a permit. And anytime that somebody applies for a permit, the Regional Water Board evaluates that permit based on the basin plan. So they have to take a look and see if that permit is going to be impacting water quality and at what level. And based on that information and based on the goals in the basin plan, the Regional Water Board either approves or denies permits. And then based on how permits are implemented, if people are violating the conditions in a permit or maybe causing water quality impacts that were detrimental to water quality objectives, at that point, the Regional Water Board can then issue enforcement actions, either in the manner of fines or asking people to stop their water quality impact projects. All right. So tribal beneficial uses. Tribal beneficial uses are these three, and they're really available to help protect specific activities that are unique to Native American communities. So this includes tribal subsistence fishing that maybe identifies the unique ways that tribal communities fish that are not currently captured under the subsistence fishing beneficial use, as well as tribal tradition and culture. This can include basket weaving, ceremonies, and other activities where there is an exposure to water. So now I want to walk through the different steps the water boards may take to protect water quality. And I know that we're going pretty quickly here, but I want to plug that we have this guidance document in the back that has more information about each of the unique steps. All right, so before we go into the unique steps, what I want to mention is, again, the regional water boards are semi-autonomous. So what that means is each regional water board is approaching this process a little bit uniquely. So it's really important to get connected to your regional tribal coordinator to learn about how they're approaching the tribal beneficial use project in your region. So here are some general steps, and I will let you know which of these steps could be taken at the same time. First, I want to start with these ongoing steps that are at the bottom. So an ongoing step is to engage with California Native American tribes and the public throughout this process. So many regions have, I see your question. I'll take after this slide. Many regions have held tribal summits to engage with tribal leaders on the process of TBUs. Some have held public workshops on this process, and some have met already with tribes through a government-to-government consultation. So regions are approaching this in many different ways, but the whole effort is to engage with tribes and tribal communities throughout the process. You'll notice that AB 52 consultation actually takes place way later down in the process, but regional water boards are engaging with tribes now, and that's going to continue on throughout. The other ongoing step that could take place is prioritizing tribal beneficial uses in the triennial review. So regional water boards have their basin plan, and every 3 years they have an opportunity to open up that basin plan and to determine if there's any needed changes or amendments that have to happen. So adding the tribal beneficial use designation, it requires a basin plan amendment. So in order for a regional water board to work on that, it could be helpful for their staff to prioritize that as a high priority project. The reason that's helpful is because when there's projects that are designated as high priority, there's staff and resources dedicated to accomplishing that more quickly. So we recommend that if your regional water board is engaging in that triennial review, looking at their basin plan, that you engage in that process and let them know that you want to see this project be prioritized. All right. So beginning with step 1, adding the tribal beneficial use designation into the basin plan. So the State Water Board has already defined tribal beneficial uses, and you can find the definitions in this educational overview document. But in order for the regional water boards to designate a water body with those definitions, they essentially have to add those definitions into their basin plan. So in the menu of options of all possible beneficial uses that could be applied in their region. So that takes place through a basin plan amendment. Some regional water boards are doing this step independently. They're adding that definition and then moving on to step 2, which is identifying the water bodies. Some regional water boards are doing this process together. They are adding the definition and saying, these are the water bodies that we want to designate with this use. So again, it's going to depend on each regional water board. In between step 1 and step 2 is really engaging with California tribes and the public and tribal communities. This is really where we need to hear from you all. What are the water bodies that you all want us to protect? And how would you want us to protect these water bodies? So in step 1 and step 2, at that point, CEQA has not yet been triggered, but we may be engaging and consulting with tribes under our tribal consultation policy and creating opportunities for the public to also be providing feedback. So step 3 is where we are actually identifying water bodies and then requesting those water bodies to be designated with tribal beneficial uses. At that point in the process, CEQA may be triggered. And when CEQA is triggered, the California Environmental Quality Act, when CEQA is triggered, AB 52 consultations are also triggered. So at that point in the process, when the Regional Water Board is developing the basin plan amendment to designate that water, all of the tribes that are within that regional water board will receive consultation request letters to engage with the regional water boards on those designations. One thing I want to note about the way that the water boards approaches AB 52 is that we recognize that it's a barrier to have tribes request to be added to our AB 52 consultation list. So one of the best practices that we have incorporated is we will send out letters to everybody who has requested to be on our list. And we will also send out letters to all of the tribes and the Native American Heritage Committee list within that region. So all tribes within that region will receive a formal notification to consult at that point in the process. Like all CEQA processes, tribal consultation begins first. A few months later is when the public is also engaged in this. We'll have a public hearing to also talk about the basin plan amendment and to hear public input at that point in the process. The next step, and again, step 3 and step 4, they may come together. But the next step, after we have identified which water bodies, tribes, and tribal communities would like to request to be designated with these uses, is to establish or amend water quality objectives and develop implementation programs. So through this consultation and through engagement, we may find that the existing water quality objectives are not sufficient. We may find that in order to protect tribal uses of water, we might need to revise our water quality objectives. And at that point, the Regional Water Board will need to develop a monitoring program to get to those goals, and may need to think about any remediation that needs to happen. So at that point in the process, the Regional Water Board can, at the Regional Water Board level, pass that amendment. After the Regional Water Board has passed that amendment, it goes back to the State Water Board. And the State Water Board then passes a resolution to either approve or deny that basin plan amendment. If the State Water Board adopts or approves that basin plan amendment, the Regional Water Board can now be using that updated basin plan to review incoming water quality permits. And as they're reviewing those permits, they can evaluate how those permits are going to be impacting tribal beneficial uses. I'm pausing to see if there's anything that we missed here in terms of the basin plan process. No? Okay. All right, so this was a lot. I want to actually pause here before we move on to another slide. Let's take questions about the basin planning process, and then we'll continue moving on.
Hello. Hello. So what I'm wondering is, you haven't really identified that each of these regions is on a different step.
Exactly.
Because we're in Region 5 and I'm on Step 3. And we have actually voiced our opinion several times that we do not want to be lumped in with the public.
Yeah, that's really good feedback.
I've written letters. I've given you guys that feedback. So a lot of the different regions are all at different steps, because in Region 5, like where we're at, it's been adopted and it's been put in the basin plan.
Exactly. So part after this section, we'll go through all of the 9, and you'll be able to see, you know, some regions like Region 5, Region 4, and the Lahontan region. Those are the 3 regions that are farther along. Some of them are early on, and you'll also notice that some haven't even started. So you'll start to get an understanding of across the state the different different levels of engagement that has been happening, and that'll help kind of let you know the statewide engagement. But your comment around feedback around tribes and the public, that's super helpful. This document that we have here is draft, and we've heard that comment. So we'll definitely be revising that in our materials to be clear, you know, what steps do California tribes take, and then what steps does the public take? Thank you.
So to check with, do we check with you to make sure who is on, who's being contacted or receiving the notifications? You see what I mean? Because AB 52, especially through the Native American Heritage Commission, is going to go to our TIPO staff typically. And so that might be different in some tribes, depending on if your natural resources department is, you know, separate from your TIPO or culture department. So do we check with you or our regional office to make sure who is all on that contact list if we want to add individuals, to make sure that everybody's getting notified? Because, you know, sometimes, you know, forwarding emails, you try to keep up on it, but it doesn't always get there.
Yeah, really good point. On our Tribal Affairs website, and Elizabeth, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we have a table where you're able to add your tribe and you're able to see the AB 52 requests that we've received and the contacts. If that's not on there and if we've removed it, then let me know and we can double check.
Since this program is so new, if there's water that's needed for their species, are you guys going to take away from people who already have water rights? So, for example, agriculture, who's like using as much water as they want, and they don't really monitor their groundwater, but it affects the surface water. Like, what happens in that instance where the tribes need water for the fishes, but they can't get it because everyone's over pumping groundwater?
That's really helpful. So this process, the process that the regional water boards implement through the basin plan process, it's focused on water quality. But what we know is that water quality is also impacted by temperature. And so that's a connection that we could explore through this process. It's not focused on water rights or water levels, but we know that temperature is impacted by decreases in water levels. And that's one of the things that is factored through this.
So, what's the difference between water quality objectives and water quality standards?
That's really good. A really great question. So water quality standards are statewide standards that we all have to meet. But a region may determine that that statewide standard is not sufficient for that beneficial use at that local level. So they may want to have water quality objectives, which are goals that are maybe stricter based on those beneficial uses.
There is. Okay, so there is one question coming from online, and it was, have any TBUs been designated on specific water bodies and or the underlying criteria objectives to protect any TBUs?
That's a great segue. So let's continue on and talk about the regional water boards, and we'll have an overview of what's taking place across the state. All right, so let's start with the North Coast Regional Water Board. So the North Coast, what's unique about the North Coast Regional Water Board is that before the State Water Board defined and adopted definitions for tribal beneficial uses, the Regional Water Board and the tribes in that area work to develop beneficial uses that protect Native American culture and subsistence fishing. So the North Coast Regional Water Board is unique in that they've established their own unique beneficial use. However, they're also working on the process of adopting the statewide tribal beneficial use definitions into their basin plan. Your point person on the North Coast Board is Cody Walker, and his information is on the slide. At this time, there isn't an upcoming meeting that's currently scheduled. All right, moving into the San Francisco Bay. So the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Board is currently in the process of gathering data for their designation. As part of their triennial review, where they looked at their basin plan, they prioritized the tribal beneficial use project. And in terms of their process, they're gonna be adopting the definitions at the same time that they're designating the water bodies. They recently had a tribal summit last week. And at this time, they are requesting letters of support for tribal beneficial use designations from tribes. Your contact person for the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Board is Sammy Harper, and her contact is on the slide. And I also want to note that several tribes are also engaged in providing feedback as part of that triennial review process. All right, moving into the Central Coast. So the Central Coast, sorry about the formatting, but the Central Coast is currently working to adopt the tribal beneficial uses into their basin plan. They're gonna begin that process with tribal outreach and engagement in 2023, where they're gonna be really rolling out this tribal beneficial uses definitions process. At this time, There was no tribal engagement in the triennial review process, but hopefully next year, once they engage more formally in that TBU definition process, hopefully they'll be able to work more one-on-one with tribes to get feedback. And the tribal coordinator in this regional water board is Daniel Ellis. All right, so the Los Angeles Regional Water Board. So they have just reached a really big milestone. This regional water board is one of the three that is further along in their process. So on October 18th, the State Water Board approved a resolution to adopt the LA Regional Water Board's Basin Plan Amendment. So the Regional Water Board, LA Regional Water Board Basin Plan now includes tribal beneficial use definitions. So where they're at now is they're working on this designation. So what are the water bodies that they want to designate with these beneficial uses? So at this time, submitting letters in support of which water bodies you'd like to see designated would also be really helpful. And at the bottom, you can see the number of tribes that have participated in public workshops or have submitted letters of support. All right, the Central Valley Regional Water Board is also further along in their process. They also reached a significant milestone in adopting tribal beneficial uses into their basin plan. So where they are in the process, they're gathering data for those designations to identify water bodies and identify water quality objectives for those water bodies. On November 10th, they're going to be having a tribal beneficial uses update meeting, and your point of contact for this regional water board is Adriana Ross. And 5 tribes have submitted letters of support for this basin plan amendment to include tribal beneficial use definitions into their basin plan. All right, the Lahontan region, the 3rd regional water board that's further along in their process. So they have adopted tribal beneficial uses into their basin plan, and they have recently confirmed that they're going to move forward with designating the Mono Lake Basin as the first water body designated in this region. So this is the regional water board that's further along in this process, and hopefully through this process, all of the regional water boards and all of us will learn as how this process unfolds. In February 2023, they're requesting designation requests for other water bodies besides the Mono Lake Basin. So if you're part of this region and there are other water bodies that you'd like to include in that designation, February 2023 would be a deadline to aim for. And then your point of contact for the Lahontan region is Danny McClure. All right, so the Colorado River Basin Regional Water Board, they are currently working on adopting tribal beneficial uses into their basin plan. They had a tribal summit to talk about the triennial review, and 2 tribes did submit letters of support to prioritize tribal beneficial uses. Their point of contact for this region is Maria Davidoda. All right. The Santa Ana Regional Water Board, they're currently working on adopting the definitions into their basin plan. They don't have upcoming meetings scheduled just yet, but Claudia Tenorio is your point of contact for the Santa Ana region. All right, so the last regional water board, San Diego. San Diego did prioritize tribal beneficial uses in their triennial review, which means that in the coming year, they're going to be focusing in on this process even more. And they have adopted tribal beneficial use definitions into their basin plan. So in the coming year, they're going to be working with tribes in this region to identify water bodies to designate. Your point of contact for the San Diego region is Cynthia Gorham. All right. I want to pause right here, and I want to see if there's any reflections or questions about updates on the regional water board efforts. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
My question is,
you're mentioning that tribes have to be proactive in designating a water body. However, if a basin already knows it's the water bodies within that basin, why wouldn't all the water bodies be covered with the TBUs automatically? And second is, if a tribe were to do by tribal resolution protecting all water bodies within its jurisdictional lands, would that be automatic and have the water boards just accept that tribal resolution on that government to government basis?
That's a really good question. Some regional water boards, the San Diego region in particular, is exploring that model. What would it look like to designate all water bodies within this region with tribal beneficial uses? So that is a possibility that some regions are exploring. One thing I want to clarify is that when the water boards was engaging with tribes in the development of the definitions process, one of the main points that we heard from tribes is that tribes wanted to make sure that designations come directly from California tribes. So one of our requirements that we have is anyone can engage in this process, but in order for us to designate a water, it has to come from an official tribal government leader requesting that designation.
Now, I respect that process on behalf of that tribal designation. The other is what is being done at a higher level at the board planning process when a tribe does a personhood status or rights of natures for its tribal water bodies. Because that would be something then that I don't think has happened in California. And I know that I'm from Department of Water Resources, so we would be deferring those types of questions to your shop. And I think that it's maybe a question in the future.
Yeah, that hasn't come up. A similar thing that has come up for us is the US EPA has a designation on outstanding waters. And so there are some outstanding waters in California that have established that designation of outstanding waters. So as part of that, those regions that have water bodies that have the outstanding waters designation are factoring that into this tribal beneficial use process.
How does a tribe go for TBUs in separate regions? Like, for example, a lot of the members in the tribe that I work for, they travel to the coast. So they go into region 1 and they do whatever kind of collections for, their culture. So what happens at that point?
Well, I welcome your feedback on that. So it's in the case where there's a tribe whose ancestral land is in a different region, but they may travel to do ceremonies and waters in another region. Is that right? Collection. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the challenging things about the way that the regional water boards is established, is that the boundaries don't quite make sense. And tribal boundaries don't follow that either. So that's definitely a challenge. One of the things that we've been trying to do to address that is to be proactive about the updates that different regions are engaging in. So that if there's a tribe that is impacted by decisions in multiple regions, I would encourage them to get involved and to share. Maybe what I would recommend is their designation request. It could be the same designation request, but maybe just sharing it with a different tribal coordinator so that everybody has that same designation request.
I would also suggest like getting in touch with, the tribes of the area where your folks are visiting, so you can talk amongst yourselves how you want to work that out. There's also the Tribal Marine Stewards Network that's just new. It doesn't cover the whole coast, but if it's an area that is covered, they have a website, you might check into that also, so tribes can figure that out amongst each other, how coastal tribes could support inland tribes on, visiting the coast and collecting resources. It's I think it's tribal MS. There you go. So my question is, do non-tribal entities have the ability to comment on or disagree with TBUs being included in the basin plan. I'm just wondering what happens in the situation where you have local governments or for-profit businesses or even private citizens who want to argue against tribal beneficial uses when the point brought up about, agriculture, especially having disagreement over water quality standards, for our uses versus what they want to use the water for, and them seeing us as a threat. And what happens in that instance where, we're wanting to get our TBUs in there and they're fighting us on it.
That's a great question. Thank you, Amanda. It's true. This is a public process. So in this public process, either at the regional water board level, when they're going through the basin plan amendment process, as well as the CEQA process that requires that public workshop and the public comment period, those are opportunities when anyone can comment, anyone can be engaged in that. But what I want to come back to is that this is a process that was created by tribes for tribes, right? And our job as the water boards is to make sure that we are protecting these beneficial uses of water, and we are relying on the leadership and the knowledge of tribes to help us get there. So yes, there's always going to be public input, and we welcome all of that. And the purpose of this is to protect water quality for tribal purposes.
Mike Shaver with Middletown Rancheria. I guess I'd like to follow up on two of the tribal comments regarding multiple regions. The Middletown Rancheria does straddle your Central Valley, your North Coast, and your Bay Area regions. So we plan to do the same. We're working so far with Central Valley, but the same designations we'll be doing for the other regions, just in a repetitive fashion. And then on the comment about my tribal council also does wish to include all the waters within our area, with our ancestral lands as being beneficial uses to the tribe. But the state does ask for what you use those for. So you can't just say the area, from my understanding. You need to say the use in a general way. So we're starting off by just saying native plants, sedges, tules are almost everywhere. Every body of water that shows up a Blue Line Creek should have a sedge in it. So I think that's a good way to broadly cover all your water bodies. But I must also say, when it comes to the point about disagreeing entities, we have concerns there's ag interests in our county that may not want a tribal beneficial use on a slough or a pond area that they're using for ag use. So more you want to limit what you share with them in your collection, but more you share, if you get into fisheries collection, things a little higher up the food chain, there's a higher level of exposure, which if you do share that information to a limited amount, it gives the water board more ability to protect your right. So the tribes need to balance how much you want to share, minimal just to cover it all. But if you really want, if you end up in disagreements with other entities, more information may empower the state water board to help protect your right more.
Really great tips and feedback and guidance for others who are maybe new in that process. Thank you so much. Part of what we're going to do with this handout is talk about that, because it is a balance. We need to know information, but we don't want to know that much, because this is a public process. So anything that is shared with us will be public. So we'll talk a little bit about confidentiality when we go through that handout.
Yeah, mine is similar to that question. Sort of how with the EPA is struggling with the traditional ecological knowledge, is there going to be sort of a bare minimum of what, tribes can disclose, but still get access to those TBUs? Because, people have used beneficial uses, cultural activities against tribes before. So I think it'd be important for people to disclose as minimal as possible, but you still have to get your point across. So is there going to be any kind of minimum disclosure?
Yeah, that's really great. So why don't we transition to our handout and talk about some of the questions that we have in there. So again, we had some of these handouts in the back. We were originally thinking about using this time to do breakouts, but instead what we're going to do is we'll walk through this handout, and then afterwards we'll use the remainder of the time to hear from folks who have been engaged in the process, who maybe have advice for others who are new in this process. All right. So if you go into this handout, we have a couple of reflection questions based on the different tribal beneficial uses. The first part of the questions include questions to help you think about tribal tradition and culture. So if you just go to the PowerPoint. Thank you.
This is the handout?
So in that section of the handout, we have the definition for that specific beneficial use, and we're asking general reflection questions about the type of activities or practices that are currently taking place or have historically taken place. The reason we ask questions around historical practices is because we want to know, has impacts to the water impacted those practices? Have there been any changes because of the changes of the water? One of the questions I want to highlight is the question around when these practices take place, because that's when we are encountering issues around confidentiality. So what we are not requesting is we are not requesting specific locations of ceremonial sites or practices. We do not want to have specific locations. General areas around the river, you can say, or general areas around this lake bed. You know, this takes place in the fall around this area of the river. That is sufficient for us. We do not need to know precise locations. We do not need to know precise dates. So that's one thing to note about. And what we do ask is if you're concerned about confidentiality or the level of information that you want to include in your designation requests, I would encourage you to have a phone call with us, and we can talk through some of that data, and we can confirm together what information it would be best to leave out of that designation letter. So again, we're not requesting specific locations, specific dates, or specific times. General seasons. All right. Some of the other questions I want to highlight in this beneficial use reflection question is related to exposure. So part of what the water boards has to do is it has to look at public health. And that's why we're asking questions around how long are people exposed to the water? Are people submerged in the water? Is it children, pregnant people? So those are the type of questions that we will need to ask to get information about public health that will help us and help develop water quality objectives. So questions around exposure or frequency are really helpful for us to start identifying those water quality objectives. The part 2 of this worksheet relates to tribal subsistence fishing. And again, similar for this beneficial use, what we are not looking for is specific fishing locations. General areas, general rivers, general practice like frequency and times is fine for designations. We just need to know a general area of locations. And again, if you're unsure, you can give us a call. Again, for the tribal subsistence fishing, what's really important are the questions that relate to health impacts. So questions around frequency, methods of consumption, whether it's raw or cooked, that influences the public health goals. So those are the reasons why we have some of those consumption related questions included there. All right, in part 3 and part 4 of this worksheet. So part 3 includes a basin mapping tool. And we encourage you to go onto the basin mapping tool and explore the beneficial uses that are currently designated in your region. So now that you know which regional water board is responsible for protecting water for tribal purposes, you can go on, explore the map, and look at the way that they're currently designating those bodies of water. And here's some guiding questions to help you kind of create your plan to engage. And then in part 4, we have a couple of different options for how California tribes, tribal members, and interested members of the public can engage in this process. So just to kind of recap that engagement piece, in order for us to designate a water body, we have to receive an official designation on a tribal government letterhead signed by a tribal chairperson. That's what officially triggers a designation. However, even if you are not part of your tribal leadership, we encourage you to go to your tribal council, to speak to your tribal leadership, to speak to cultural practitioners within your community, and to have conversations around this process. I also encourage you to connect with your tribal coordinators at the regional level and to form a relationship with them so that you can be engaged at every step of the process. We covered a lot of information here today, but one of the main takeaways I want to share is that this is a long process, right? It took us a long time to get here, and the process of designating will also be a several-year-long process. So throughout this time, we really want to continue building relationships with you, and we want to really emphasize that this is a process created by tribes and led by tribes, and so we're really looking for your leadership and your guidance in this. So at this time, I want to pause and see if there's any questions. And if there isn't, I'd like to then open it up to any of you. There's several people who have been actively engaged in the tribal beneficial use process at the different regions. And I'd like to hear if you have any advice or guidance for others who may be new to this. So I'll pause for questions, and then I'd like to hear from you.
Hi, I'm Josie Kamkoff with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. I have some useful opportunity, and it is exclusive to folks in Region 7, the Colorado River watershed, or you're calling them basins. Yeah. So we have an internship opportunity for all tribes within the Colorado River basin. It's a water resource and land management internship program. So if there are any tribes who are within that basin, and you would like to get an intern from, like, we're able to accept your application, approve it, and find a set of interns from colleges around the nation for you to interview for that internship. Just go to ITEP online at Northern Arizona University, go to the internship program, and we only have 3 programs, so just pick the one that is for the Colorado River Basin.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that resource.
Hi, Emily Maloney, Water Program Coordinator with Buena Vista Rancheria. My question is about how is the regional water boards designating staff time to work on this program, whether it's dealing with designation requests or then eventually working with conducting all the studies, toxicology, for developing water quality objectives that are protective of the tribal beneficial uses.
Really good question. And that takes place at the triennial review. So every 3 years, they open up those basin plans and they say, okay, what changes do we want to make to these plans? And one of the changes that they could prioritize is this project. So if they prioritize tribal beneficial uses, what that means is they're dedicating staff time. And if there is that dedication of staff time, it's more likely that this project will move forward quicker and with more dedicated resources. So you'll notice that the regional water boards that are farther along, they're the ones that had prioritized tribal beneficial uses in their triennial review.
Mike Shaver with Middletown Rancheria again. Yeah, I guess we had been participating in the triennial review for the Central Valley. And the way you're showing the map, I assume that all the basins had included in their triennial review. I guess that's something that we should probably follow in the North Coast area and also the basin, the Bay Area basin. But my question is, earlier in the process, they described possibly forming a tribal advisory group. I was tending more to like a working group, because many things we do in the Central Valley will then be repeated in the North Coast. Is there an effort to have a statewide working group for tribes to kind of share information?
Well, we welcome that feedback. When the Central Valley Regional Water Board was proposing having a tribal advisory committee, we heard a lot of feedback from tribes around how advisory committees raise a lot of concerns. So instead, they're having more tribal summits and a separate public process in order to address some of those concerns. But if there is a need or a desire to have more of a statewide ongoing coordination, especially to address some of the issues that have been mentioned around overlapping in regions, we're welcome to think about that.
So the last the step 5 is implement the water quality objectives into the permits and enforcement actions. So what types of permits would be impacted by the tribal beneficial uses? And are those types of permits, are they the same for all of the different regions, or do regions have their own unique permits? And then specifically as far as ag, would it influence like how they're using the water or how much water they can use?
Good questions. So the state water establishes statewide permits, and then the regional water boards enforce them. So for example, there's a waste discharge requirement permit that people can apply to if they're doing activities that discharge water into a water body. So when they're reviewing those permits for those waste discharge, they have to think about how is this permit or the activities within this permit going to be impacting all the beneficial uses. And if they're not able to maintain those water quality objectives, they may consider denying that permit. So that's an example. And in terms of water supply, this is a process that's focused on water quality. All right, we have 5 minutes. I know we have one last question. And then for the remainder of the time, I would like to hear if there's any other guidance. Mike has shared really great tips. I want to hear if there's any others from folks who have been engaged.
Sorry. So I just wanted to ask quickly. So I've heard you say that the regions can prioritize this in the triennial review. What I'm wondering is there a deadline for them to engage in this project, or is there any sort of requirement to that's making them do this, or do the tribes have to basically, really hound them to do it if they're not doing it? Because up in the North Coast region, as you said, they haven't done it yet, and there's no upcoming meetings for it. And the last email I have from the Cody Walker saying support letter. They want tribes to submit a support letter to adopt TBU definitions. I'm just wondering if there's a mechanism that's like going to kind of force their hand to engage in this.
Really great. And that's a really important thing to know is that no. The regional water boards are not required to adopt tribal beneficial use definitions, and they're not required to designate them. So again, this is based on the way that regional water board leadership prioritizes their work. So if we think that these are important things that should be prioritized, that's something that we should be vocal about and that you all should engage to make sure that is a priority. But there is no requirement. But I think just so that you know, as more regions engage in this process, there is learning that's taking place at the regions. Some of them are looking at others and following. So there is that learning that's taking place, and also a little bit of that pressure, right? If they're seeing other regions engaging in this process, they're also experiencing the pressure of not engaging. So although they're not required, they do have that pressure to move forward. All right, we have two minutes. I want to pause and I want to see if there's any other advice that you would want to bring up and share with the team. I know that you have been engaged in the Central Valley region. I don't know if there's any reflections you'd like to share for the group.
It's kind of hard to keep up because a lot of the employee turnover. So you'll be emailing one person, all of a sudden they don't work on that anymore. So do be aware of that.
Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, challenges with staff turnover. Absolutely. Other reflections or tips, general tips that folks want to uplift? Advice you would give to new people engaging in this process?
Sorry, I'm going back to questions. Still have a question. At least in the Lahontan region, it seems like there's kind of a triage when they are opening up the basin plan. They can only do so much. And I guess I'm just curious, it'd be nice if there was more than just that one period to comment on these tribal designated uses, so that tribes had time to think and contribute. And it wasn't just the doors open and now it's closed and they're moving on to other things.
Yeah, that's a really good comment. And this is ongoing. For the Lahontan region specifically, they're going to be doing 2 tracks. They've received a designation request from the Kutsadika tribe to designate the Mono Lake Basin. So they're moving forward with that process. And hopefully as they designate the Mono Lake Basin, they will learn, and then they can continue to designate other basins or other watersheds within that region. So they're kind of doing a parallel track. So still opportunities to continue engaging. All right, so I know that we're at time. We're gonna stay here, and maybe Mike, we can connect offline too. But I want to thank you all again for your time. Our contact information is on the documents. If you are having trouble, like they mentioned, with contacting your tribal coordinator, you can contact Elizabeth and myself. We have kind of a bird's eye view of all of the regions. So if you want to just have a check-in meeting about many regions, we're open to that too. And with that, I want to thank you so much for your time.